If you own multiple rental properties, should you put each rental property into its own LLC? Should you use multiple LLCs or should you use multiple trusts? What does estate planning look like when you are a real estate investor? Super common question. We love real estate investors at Speedwell Law. I'm Misha Gill. Let's dive into it. This is a critical piece of estate planning because this is both asset protection and probate avoidance combined. When you have a high friction asset like rental property, efficiency matters. How are you going to pass that on to the next generation while at the same time limiting your liability when it comes to potential lawsuits that might put those assets at risk, or maybe the liability even comes from those assets. And so you want to structure your assets to protect yourself from potential creditors and do your estate planning at the same time. So let's look into it. All right, let's tackle the initial question. Should you have one trust or multiple trusts? Unless your estate is over $13.96 million as of 2025, then you probably do not need multiple trusts. You probably just need one living trust, a revocable living trust, to manage your estate after you are gone. And that is going to keep control with you and benefit with you and provide for probate avoidance. So you don't generally need an irrevocable trust unless you are that level of wealth where you are over $13.96 million or 27.92 if you're a married couple. Now, you do need to keep in mind that the Rev Trust here is not providing the asset protection features. Revocable living trusts do not provide asset protection for the grantor's creditors. The grantor is still the person controlling the trust, benefiting from the trust, and transferring assets to the trust in a way that's amendable and revocable. So revocable living trusts do not provide creditor protection to the person making the trust, only to the beneficiaries of the trust. The main thing that you're accomplishing by setting up a living trust when you're a real estate investor is probate avoidance and unified control and management after you're gone. Now, you may be wondering, should you set up a land trust? A land trust can be useful in the real estate investor context. I've done videos on them, so go look it up. A land trust can be very useful for minimizing friction between different properties. You avoid the setup and management costs of LLCs, but you don't gain the creditor protections. So a land trust can be useful in certain contexts, but for asset protection, a land trust is not the best option. Some people will tell you that you can create a land trust and get that by the bank, and then after the fact, transfer the land interest to an LLC, and then the bank never finds out about that. Can't advise you to do that because that's potentially a fraudulent transaction, a fraudulent conveyance, because it's for the purpose of avoiding a creditor. So if you do not have a mortgage, then that might be available to you. But because most people finance their real property investments with debt, then you won't be a candidate for doing your estate planning with a land trust until that property is all the way paid off, at which time it can be useful to silo and segment your liability with land trusts and LLCs. So if that's you, please be sure to reach out to me. We can have a great conversation and I can show you how we can add a lot of value to the equation. Now, back to the main question at hand. You have multiple real properties. Should you have multiple LLCs? The first thing you have to understand is that everyone exists on a continuum of risk. This is a bit of a fact-specific inquiry. Where does risk come from in your case? That will dictate the strategy to a certain extent, because if you're in a high liability field of work, such as plastic surgeon, advanced machine operator, then business in general, being a business person involves the threat of being sued at any given point. You might be best off siloing each property into its own LLC because that provides maximum protection. It silos and segments the liability so that each bucket of capital is in its own different bucket, right? That can be beneficial. There's also friction associated with putting properties into LLCs. You have the setup fees, the annual minutes that you have to do, the annual registration fees to pay, a registered agent to pay, and potentially setting up a bank account. It can get to be a lot. There is a blended approach available. There's a middle ground where you could have a grouping of properties in each LLC. If you put your multifamilies in one LLC, it should probably have its own LLC. If you're gonna have condos in another LLC or single family homes in its own LLC, that can be a viable strategy depending on your facts. There's also another rule of thumb where it depends on your level of risk, but you could put somewhere between $1 and $3 million worth of assets, depending on your level of risk. That's a decision that you should make with counsel, with an attorney. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to multiple LLCs is where you hold property. If you hold property in multiple states, the friction is going to be lower if you establish an LLC in the state where the property lies. You can register a foreign LLC to do business in another state. Maybe that's the way to go. Just depends on your appetite for that rigmarole. Another thing to consider when deciding how many LLCs to set up is the liability risk associated with each property. The classic example of this would be a single family home that has a pool. Pools are more risky for homeowners. So you might want to put that property in its own LLC versus other properties which do not have pools. So in summary, when it comes to grouping LLC properties, if you have the same asset type in the same location, like 4 duplexes in Birmingham, Alabama, you would potentially be okay putting that all into one LLC. You just have to be practical about it. You got to weigh the cost and the benefit. The more LLCs you have, the more fees and tax filings associated with that. So you have to balance the protection against the practicality. 3 to 5 similar properties per LLC would be the rule of thumb. Now, turning back to the structure, as you can see behind me, this is how we would structure a multiple LLC client's estate plan. At the very top, you have the living trust, which owns Holdco, and then Holdco owns all of the sub LLCs. And what we just talked about was how many properties you're going to put into each sub LLC. So why do we do it this way? To silo and segment the liability at the asset level, another layer of liability. This is also going to add a level of efficiency when it comes to managing the portfolio of properties. The Holdco is where you're going to have potentially officers and directors or a manager, or you could bring in partners if you want to liquidate part of your holdings. Most of the action is going to be at that level when it comes to financial engineering. Each sub LLC is going to contain its own reservoir of capital assets. Common mistakes in real estate investor planning with LLCs and living trusts. Mistake number 1 is thinking that the revocable trust adds any kind of creditor protection. A revocable living trust does not add any creditor protection for the person that is making the trust. It only adds creditor protections when the person who made the trust dies and there is a new trustee and new beneficiaries. At that point, the trust has become irrevocable, and that's when it provides creditor protections to the beneficiaries and only to the beneficiaries. Trustees are the ones who hold legal title on behalf of the beneficiaries and are subject to lawsuits. Mistake number 2 is mixing high liability, high risk assets and low liability, low risk assets in one LLC. It's better to segment and silo high risk properties into their own LLC. Mistake number 3 is ignoring state registration rules for out-of-state LLCs. This is why you should probably create an LLC in the state in which you hold that property. If you're looking to do your estate planning and you own multiple rental properties, here's what you're gonna do. You're going to create your living trust. You're gonna create an LLC plan based on the criteria that we've discussed here, based on location, risk, profile, specific requirements, etc. And then you're gonna make the plan work all synergistically so that the LLCs are owned by the living trust by and through a hold company. If you'd like help setting up your own real estate investment estate plan, please reach out to us at Speedwell Law. We'd be very happy to help you.